September 1942. The Second World War started 3 years ago. Japan declared war on Germany and Italy, becoming a British and Soviet ally. After Pearl Harbor, the USA declared war on Japan, then on the United Kingdom, allied with Japan. Now the USA, Germany, and Italy are together against the UK, the Soviets, and Japan. The war involves the entire world. Canada has fallen to the USA. In the Atlantic, the Royal Navy is fighting against German U-boats and the US Navy. Japan and the USA are clashing in the Pacific. The Japanese dominate the ocean, but they have been stopped at Midway. In Africa, the Axis tries to break the British resistance at El Alamein. In China, Japanese forces have large successes south of Shanghai, but the bloodiest front is the Eastern Front. Russia, October 1942. The Battle of Stalingrad begins when the 6th Army and elements of the 4th Panzer Army reach the city. Zhukov is the commander of the Stalingrad defenses. The battle quickly degenerated into house-to-house fighting. On November the 19th, 1942, the Red Army launches Operation Uranus, a two-pronged attack targeting the Romanian armies protecting the 6th Army's flanks. But in this situation, without a threat to the west and without bombings, the Axis forces are far better equipped with more reserves and hold the line. Operation Uranus fails. Heavy fighting continues at Stalingrad for another 2 months. At the beginning of February 1943, the Axis forces retreat from Stalingrad, but without the heavy losses of our timeline. March 1943, Tehran. Stalin, Churchill, and the Japanese Prime Minister Tojo have a meeting to discuss their future strategy. Churchill gives a speech saying, "These three powers are like the teeth of a trident. We will hit together all the enemies of peace." The name of Trident will remain to designate the alliance of the UK, Japan, and the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, at Peenemünde in Germany, there is the first successful launch of a V-2 rocket. The rocket reaches a height of 85 kilometers. The Americans show great interest. But the Germans don't need to invest enormous resources on this technology. There is available an easier way to bomb London. At the start of 1943, the United States Army 8th Air Force arrives in France and Normandy. The Germans never had heavy bombers and are hampered by poor aircraft range. The arrival of US bombers changes the situation. March 1943. 64 B-17 and B-24 bombers dispatched from the airbase at Châteauneuf, France, fly the first American bombing raid against the British, targeting the port of Southampton, escorted by German Messerschmitt Bf-109s. They lose 4 planes. An increasing number of raids will follow in the next months. From Norway, American B-17 bombers participated in the German effort against Leningrad. In May 1943, 250 USAAF heavy bombers are available in Europe. The Eagle Squadron, the American volunteers in the Luftwaffe, are officially transferred to US Army Air Force. General Dwight Eisenhower arrives in Berlin, ready to assume the post of commander of American forces in Europe. But in the East, the Soviets continue their slow advance. China, February 1943. The Japanese 3rd, 6th, and 40th Divisions take Changsha. March 1943. 60 Japanese battalions start the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign. April 1943. Isamu Yokoyama, commander of the Japanese 11th Army, enters Changde. In the meantime, the Soviets invade Xinjiang. The Chinese army collapses. Chiang Kai-shek surrenders in India to the British. But the communists organize guerrilla actions in northern and eastern China, behind the Japanese lines. Japan lacks sufficient manpower to control China's vast countryside. Apart from bolstering Japanese morale, the conquest brings few benefits for Japan. China is agrarian and poor. The captured territories don't have any industrial infrastructure. And the main problem for the Japanese is not China. By 1943, American factories begin to churn out seemingly endless quantities of equipment, ships, and planes. There is no match between the USA and Japan, regardless of how many initial victories there are. The population of the US in 1940 is 132 million, while the population of Japan is half, 73 million. The US produces 5 times the steel, 7 times the coal, 40 times the iron ore, 80 times the cars, and has more modern factories. The US has the resources to quickly design and produce new generations of fighters, bombers, and carriers in great numbers, while Japan mainly relies on updating pre-war designs and can't even produce enough of those. In addition, the US has all the necessities for making weapons within its borders. Japan and Britain have to import everything. In our timeline, the American immense superiority in men and equipment was being largely diverted to the European war. In this situation, the USA adopts an Asia First policy, using most of their power against Japan, and the United States of America has another trump card. During 1943, a team led by Enrico Fermi, with the participation of German scientists Karl Heisenberg and Paul Hartek, initiates the first nuclear chain reaction. The Manhattan Project has begun. The United States is the only nation which can waste resources for the development of a weapon which might work or not. August 1943, the Eastern Front. The Germans are now far from Moscow and Stalingrad and continue to lose ground. But Red Army forces have a salient near Kursk. The situation on the Eastern Front is different from our timeline. There is no Lend-Lease for the Soviets. Lend-Lease was not vital for the Soviets, but it still delivered 11,000 planes, 6,000 tanks, and 300,000 trucks. The Germans don't have to spend a fortune defending France. The Italians, Romanians, and Hungarians are still on the field. The Axis has millions more soldiers available. There is no bombing of German industries. There is a huge upgrade in the quality and quantity of German war material. New weapons, the Panther tank, and larger numbers of the Tiger heavy tanks are present at Kursk. July 5th, 1943, the Battle of Kursk begins. The Germans attack the Kursk salient with 2 simultaneous attacks from north and south. The Soviets launch powerful counterattacks, one of which leads to a large armored clash, the Battle of Prokhorovka. They cannot stop the Germans. After 4 days in the Kursk salient, 6 Soviet armies are cut off and destroyed. The Soviets lose 3,000 tanks. From now on, the Soviets will be unable to launch further important offensives.
The situation is worsening for the other teeth of the Trident II. In the Pacific, the Battle of the Marshall starts. May 1943, United States Marines land on Kwajalein but sustain high casualties. September 1943, the 503rd Parachute Regiment under MacArthur lands on Wing. The fighting on the island will continue to the end of the war. In the Atlantic, British convoy losses are increasing. Everything has to arrive through waters infested with German submarines, which are often resupplied in the USA's harbours, and there is the increasing presence of the US Navy. The German Admiral Dönitz moved the Tirpitz from Norway to the United States Atlantic coast, where it will be better protected from air attacks. UK has to maintain her vital supply lanes to places like India and South Africa in order to keep her industrial base supplied. The Arctic route is dangerous and the Persian route is long, whilst Persia could switch sides at any moment. There are the continued bombings of the British industrial areas. The USAAF based in France is now a formidable force. September 1943. Liverpool is heavily bombed in Operation Gomorrah, which at the time is the heaviest air assault in history. Birmingham and Manchester are bombed, then Sheffield, London, Plymouth, Leeds, Glasgow. The Luftwaffe increases the raids. An air raid on Edinburgh causes a 7-day firestorm. 20th of September. The Luftwaffe and USAAF drop 2,300 tons of bombs on London. Sometimes there are heavy losses between the bombers. The American hoped that the Flying Fortress B-17 with its 13 Brownings 12.7mm would be able to take on the RAF fighters, especially when they are flying in formation, proved to be wrong. September 1943. Of the 290 B-17 bombers sent on the mission over Leeds, 60 are lost outright, and another 29 are damaged so heavily that they have to be scrapped, despite of the air cover of the German FW-190 fighters. Other targets are hit. The USAF bombs Alexandria in Egypt and Malta, massive bombing of Soviet industrial areas and attacks on cities such as Voronezh, Tula, Murmansk and Leningrad. The UK still has a strong fleet, 16 battleships, 52 carriers, though most of these are small escort carriers, 62 cruisers, 257 destroyers, 131 submarines and 9 other ships. But American productivity is growing enormously, and while the UK's industrial capacity is failing, the Axis powers become stronger day after day, and the British and her allies are in trouble. No Lend-Lease. It means that the US has about 30,000 planes, 26,000 tanks, 600,000 other military vehicles, over 1,800 merchant craft, and 1,400 naval vessels more. Let's compare the World War II production numbers.
The British High Command knows that in the long run there is no hope. The Royal Navy plans to draw the US Atlantic Fleet into a decisive battle. This showdown could change the war. January 5, 1944, a British naval force of 9 battleships, 15 cruisers, 19 carriers, and 33 destroyers leaves Scapa Flow, directed to the American coast. There are not divisionary movements. The British want to face up the whole US fleet. Americans cannot permit that such a force arrives too close to their coast. They have to react. 11th of January 1944. In the morning, near the Bermudas, there is the clash. The British have a strong numerical advantage, except in aircraft carriers. But the carriers are the new capital ship of naval warfare, and British naval superiority in terms of battleships is irrelevant. A battleship could fire salvos of 1,000 kilogram shells to a range of 30 kilometers. A plane like the Grumman TBF Avenger could drop a 1,000 kilogram bomb at a range of hundreds of kilometers with more precision. The British carriers has much less aircraft on board, often obsolete biplanes, and the fleet has a few modern anti-aircraft guns. Cooperation with the Royal Air Force is limited. The battle is short, but violent. The US Memphis cruiser is hit by a naval gunfire and sunk. Other 7 US destroyers are lost. The Sante and the Book USA escort carriers are torpedoed and sunk, while the Tirpitz is hit by a 380 milligram salvo but survives, and the Germans lose 2 U-boats. The British lose a carrier, the battleship HMS Duke of York, 2 cruisers, 5 destroyers, and has several ships damaged. At the end of the day, the British disengages, ending the battle. Both sides claim victory. The US lost more ships and twice as many sailors and aircraft, but succeeded in containing the Royal Navy. The British plan of destroying a substitutional portion of the US fleet also failed. But the British losses are more replaceable. While wiping out the US Navy would be pointless, America would just rebuild the Navy, getting Britain in a perpetual and unwinnable race. From now, the Royal Navy will concentrate their navy on the defensive of the island. The gates to Europe are opened. Night of 8th of March 1944, an American fleet consisting of 350 warships and 500 transports carrying 75,000 troops sails from Hampton Roads, Virginia, directed to the coast of Morocco. Operation Torch, the US invasion of Vichy-controlled North Africa, begins. In the first hours, the French opposition is harsh. They have 125,000 soldiers stationed in North Africa, coastal artillery, tanks, aircraft and warships. However, Vichy France, headed by Pétain, is a pro-Axis government and has more than a reason to hate the British. Back in 1940, the United Kingdom sunk French ships at Mersch and Caber. French colonies had been invaded by the United Kingdom, like Syria and Lebanon, Madagascar, Central Africa, and the failed attack at Dakar. Pétain orders to not oppose the American force and in the following days, France declares war on the United Kingdom. The US and 1st and 2nd Armored Division, the 1st, 3rd and 9th Infantry Divisions with General George Patton in command moves east, towards Allen on Maine.
Spain. Franco makes to Hitler and Mussolini enormous requests for food, petrol, and arms for joining the Axis. It is enormous for the Axis, not for the USA. March the 29th. After a meeting between Franco and Eisenhower in Madrid, Spain enters the war. Gibraltar surrenders. April the 22nd, 1944. Brazil declares war on the Trident, followed by Argentina and Mexico. The first US convoy arrives at Bordeaux in January 1944, carrying canned meat and spare parts. It will be followed by an increasing flow of material, and before the end of the war, the Axis will receive 18 million tons of weapons, supplies, and food. 11,000 trucks, 8,000 jeeps, 7,000 tanks, of which 4,000 are Shermans, 9,000 aircraft, 3,700 of which are P-39 variants, 8,000 motorcycles, high-octane aviation fuel, ammunition, artillery shells, explosives, and 2 million tons of food. The USA provides steel, aluminum, copper, nickel, and manganese to feed German industry. Parts of the German Tiger heavy tank are produced in the USA, then assembled in Europe. The US Sherman M4 tank is modified by the Germans, fitting it with the more powerful 88mm gun, but they will never be used on the Eastern Front. Most importantly, the Axis receives 10 million tons of vital oil. The Bahamas and Jamaica are invaded in January, and Iceland is taken in April. Bermuda is bypassed, it's fairly isolated. There is no naval or air power, and it cannot be resupplied. It is repeatedly bombed to destroy any possible threat. In the Atlantic, the Axis now has predominance. The 1st American Forces, the 2nd Corps under the command of Clark, arrives in Europe, landing at Bordeaux on January the 26th, 1944. The war continues in the Pacific. February the 17th, 1944, American Marines land on Eniwetok. On June the 15th, the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions land on Saipan. In July, the US captures Guam and Tinian. The US effort in carrier construction is just scary. The US launches 5 new Essex-class aircraft carriers in 1943 and 9 in 1944. The Japanese carriers are smaller compared to the American carriers. The Essex class carries 90 aircraft. The new Japanese carrier has only 60 aircraft. The British, distrusting its Japanese ally, fails to share its expertise in radar technology. June 19th through 20th, 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. 9 Japanese aircraft carriers and 500 land-based aircraft face the US 5th Fleet, which has 15 fleet carriers and 950 aircraft, under the command of Admiral Spruance. It is the largest carrier battle in history, and another defeat for the Japanese. The Taiho, Shokaku, and Hiyo are sunk, and 630 Japanese aircraft are lost. This is effectively the end of the Japanese carrier force. The Japanese had spent a year reconstituting their carrier air groups, and the Americans destroyed it in 2 days. Japan is now within range of American B-29 bombers. Africa, July 1944. The arrival of the American forces and the flow of ammunition and oil that follow is decisive. At El Alamein, Rommel and the Italians, re-equipped with Sherman tanks, can finally break the British 8th Army's resistance and enter Alexandria in August. In their first battle at El Hammam near El Alamein, the inexperienced American troops are forced to retreat, but the 2nd Corps of Patton will be the first Axis group to enter Cairo. Suez is taken in the first days of September 1944. Malta surrenders at the same time. August the 31st, Turkey enters the war on the Axis side. July the 26th, 1944, there is the first aerial victory for a jet fighter. An ME-262 damages a de Havilland Mosquito aircraft. The bomber version of the Me-262 delivers a payload to its target without anyone being able to do a whole lot to stop it. 4,000 Me-262 fighter bombers will be in service before the war ends. More and more American soldiers are arriving in the European theater. After the fall of Gibraltar, the more secure port of Genoa and Marseille can be used. By September 1944, 1 million American troops have arrived in France. September the 16th, Eisenhower flies to Berlin to discuss Operation Sea Overlord, the invasion of Britain.